It is July 27, 1944, German-occupied Poland. Majdanek lies under a moonless sky, yet the horizon burns. Embers glowing, smoke rising, the night lit by the crimson fire of human suffering. Red Army units press forward, boots heavy in mud, breath freezing in the smoky air. What they step into is unlike any battlefront. Not trenches, not soldiers, but a factory of death where voices are silenced before they can scream, and bodies are consumed before names can be recorded. Erich Muhsfeldt, once a baker from Newbrook, now stands at its center. His deeds will soon become murderous legend. But before justice, before reckoning, there is only this horror, this silence, this question. How far can cruelty stretch before the world can no longer look away? Erich Muhsfeldt was born on February 18, 1913, in the quiet town of Newbrook, Germany. His childhood was unremarkable. An ordinary boy, one of several siblings, his father working a modest trade, his mother caring for the home. From sunrise to dusk, Muhsfeldt would help at the bakery his father owned, mixing dough, tending ovens, kneading loaves. He played in dusty streets. He went to school. He married in his early 20s. He became a father. Life seemed simple, the kind of existence that passes by without breaking the surface. There was no sign then, no whispered prophecy, no dark turn, that this boy kneading dough would one day knead the lives of others in brutality. As he grew, Muhsfeldt's world was shaped by the turmoil enveloping Germany. The Great War, its aftermath, the Versailles Treaty, hyperinflation, political extremism, they were the air everyone breathed. In 1918, the German Empire fell. The fragile Weimar Republic rose in its place. Democracy, fragile and riven with economic crisis, struggled to satisfy a population battered by inflation, food shortages, and social unrest. Voices on all sides spoke of betrayal, of humiliation. Into that climate entered Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist movement, drawing to itself many who felt lost or dispossessed. Ordinary people who sought structure, a purpose, an identity. The disillusionment among small-town Germans like Muhsfeldt was real, though at first it meant little more than frustration or longing. By 1933, when Muhsfeldt was 20, the political tides shifted dramatically. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The door opened for the Nazi Party to consolidate power. The SA Sturmabteilung, Hitler's original paramilitary wing, surged into visibility. Brown-shirted men demanding order, suppressing political enemies, intimidating opponents. By then, many Germans were looking for strong leadership and someone to promise revival. For Muhsfeldt, this was a turning point. The promise of certainty, belonging, the idea that Germany could be restored to greatness beckoned. He joined the SA, drawn by its ritual, the sense of camaraderie, the discipline, and perhaps unconsciously, by its permission to hate. After some years in the SA, Muhsfeldt made another step in his transformation. The SS, Hitler's elite, the men tasked with enforcing ideology, secrecy, power, pulled away from the SA in prestige. In that transition, Muhsfeldt found his path. He transferred into the SS. The uniform, the insignia, the oath, all became symbols not just of loyalty but of transformation. He was no longer just a citizen or a baker or a father. He was part of something far darker. Values he once might have ignored or even opposed, racial purity, obedience, party faith, were now internalized. Where once honor may have meant community or family, now it meant loyalty to the party, to its dogma, to its enemies. In Newbrook and in countless towns like it, people began waking up each morning to changing laws, new decrees, new mandates. Jews excluded, dissidents silenced, pastors and professors warned. Propaganda filled the airwaves, the newspapers. Muhsfeldt was touched by it all, the relentless messaging, the emotional rhetoric. He saw neighbors change. People once polite and ordinary show harshness, suspicion, hatred. But the transformation for him was more than passive absorption. He made choices. He joined the SA. He later joined the SS. He volunteered for additional duties. He attended rallies. He complied, then embraced. Whether out of ambition, fear, ideology, or some darker inclination, Muhsfeldt's path was now set. What made Muhsfeldt dangerous was not just the system around him, but his willingness to adapt, to accept, to become. He adopted the symbols, the uniform, the salute. He accepted the hierarchy. He redefined his loyalties, from family, from neighbor, from what had been ordinary morality to a radical ideology. He believed increasingly that those outside the party, those defined as enemy, were less than human. And in that belief, cruelty and indifference were no longer aberrations, they were logical outcomes. The structure of the regime offered him opportunity and reward. The ideology offered him justification. Even then, in those early years, there were small cruelties, tests of obedience. Perhaps a Jewish neighbor's shop broken into by SA men, while Muhsfeldt stood by. Perhaps a political opponent arrested, and Muhsfeldt told to watch, to learn. Perhaps something that seemed small at first, participation in propaganda, denouncing someone, cheering at rallies. Each act chipped away at what he once was. Each oath, each uniform, each act of obedience moved him closer to becoming what he would later be infamous for. By the late 1930s, Muhsfeldt was no longer just part of the Nazi structure. He was an agent of its cruelty, waiting for full activation. He had embraced the transformation. When war broke out in 1939, when concentration camps began their dark operations, the machinery was ready. He had internalized the ideology, accepted the roles, trusted the chain of command. His early life had shown nothing of obvious monstrousness, but it had provided the raw materials: conformity, ambition, ideological fervor, willingness to kill what others called humanity. And thus the transformation was complete, from baker in Newbrook to active participant in genocide. When war broke over Europe in September 1939, an ominous force stirred behind the lines. Erich Muhsfeldt, whose transformation had already begun in the thicket of ideology, saw opportunity. As Germany invaded Poland, Muhsfeldt joined the SS Death's Head units, SS Totenkopfverbände, the elite corps charged with running and guarding concentration camps. These men were more than soldiers, they were administrators of terror. Course after course of obedience, cruelty, uniform and privilege, all sharpened and ready for what was coming. Muhsfeldt's ascent into the machinery of mass evil was underway. With his entry into the Death's Head units, Muhsfeldt was no longer a passive observer. His first assignments placed him at Awitz, one of the camps where prisoners were forced into brutal labor, subject to daily cruelty, hunger, and fear. At Awitz he was appointed block leader, overseeing prisoner work details, organizing forced labor assignments, and supervising the barracks, blocks, of hundreds of inmates. As Blockführer in the SS Death's Head units, he would have followed orders down the chain, but also learned the tools of domination: how to punish, how to select, how to make cruelty feel like business. The block leader role gave him power over daily life, the rations, the roll calls, the punishments. He saw how human beings broke under cold hunger fear, and he was learning what kind of person one becomes under those conditions. He didn't stay at Awitz long. As the Reich's need for extermination escalated, Muhsfeldt was transferred to Majdanek, a camp built and run not merely for forced labor, but for systematic mass murder. Here he was elevated to the role of head of the crematorium. The crematorium wasn't simply a furnace, it was a symbol and instrument of mechanized death. The ovens, the gas chambers, the death quotas, all parts of a vast system. In that role, Muhsfeldt was entrusted not only with disposing of bodies, but with overseeing experiments, refining processes, selecting victims. What started as oversight of inmates turned into selection of who would live to see dawn and who would be extinguished. Efficiency became the horrifying metric. Under Muhsfeldt's watch, mass murder operations via gas experiments became daily routine. Weak prisoners, unfit to work, those the regime considered useless, were selected for gassing. Shower rooms were converted. Poison gas was introduced. The machinery was cold and calculated. And Muhsfeldt was personally involved, choosing victims, supervising the engineers who handled the gas, administrating how many to be loaded each day, ensuring the crematoriums were fed with the steady stream of corpses. He became a pivot in the machinery of genocide, less a passive cog than an active fulcrum. The distinction: he no longer merely followed orders. He helped design the order. Muhsfeldt's cruelty became not just systemic but personal. He was known to arrive drunk many nights, the stench of alcohol mingling with the stench of death. As head of the crematorium, he carried a baton or blunt weapon, striking prisoners without rhyme or reason. Some would be beaten simply for existing, slipping, speaking, crying, showing any flicker of resistance. Others he selected to demonstrate power. A child, a young woman, someone who dared to ask why. He would preside over selections, deciding who would be gassed today, who would be worked to death tomorrow. In the cold halls of crematoriums he walked, smoke rising around him, the cries muffled by distance. Yet cruelty for Muhsfeldt was not merely physical. It was psychological terror. The block leader experience had taught him the value of fear, of uncertainty. At Majdanek he perfected it. Prisoners never knew when selections would come. The roll call standing for hours in cold, the arbitrary punishments, the sight of smoke from the ovens, the screams, these were tools. He reveled in announcements, displays, threats. He sometimes spoke to prisoners with mocking kindness before ordering their deaths, creating whiplash, hope, fear, despair. Each moment of terror designed to break not just bodies, but souls. But full horror lay in the normalization. At Majdanek, under Muhsfeldt's direction, mass murder ceased to be a rare event. It became a schedule. Gas chambers, converted from once innocent shower rooms, ovens pushed to capacity, bodies burned. On days when natural death rates among prisoners were low, selections were made to maintain quotas. The machinery of genocide required consistency: smoke, death, silence. Muhsfeldt ensured that consistency. He oversaw documentation, witnessed capacity constraints, directed burning in forest pits when ovens overflowed, coordinated with camp command about receiving transports of prisoners, many destined not to work, but to die. Through all this, Muhsfeldt's identity shifted. Once a block leader at Avits dealing with forced labor, he became the crematorium chief at Majdanek. Managing extermination, he moved upward in the hierarchy, taking responsibility not only for cruelty, but for its magnitude. It was not abstract. He felt its weight, but he embraced it. His cruelty became his mark, his role in the Nazi machine his pride. He was no longer just a participant. He was a creator of horror. In the end, this rise through the Nazi system reveals not merely the evil of one man, but how systems empower evil. Muhsfeldt's ascent shows how ideology, ambition, structure, and a willingness to accept moral contamination combine to produce a monster. He took each role, Blockführer, crematorium head, selector, and wove them into something more terrible than their parts, a person who knew deeply what cruelty meant and used it not as a tool, but as an identity. At the height of Muhsfeldt's power, horror became both spectacle and routine in Majdanek. Beatings that once might have been occasional outbursts turned into daily ritual. Smoke from the crematorium chimneys curled into the sky like black disease. The gas chambers, once crude, experimental, were refined into instruments of systematic mass destruction. Prisoners too weak to work were herded into rooms disguised as showers. Within minutes they suffocated under poison. After the bodies were emptied, the ovens would swallow them, flame-licking skin, bone, flesh. Muhsfeldt watched. He selected some himself. He supervised the firing squad, watched the gas, lit the ovens. The sick, the old, the children. No one was spared if the criteria of weakness or unusefulness were met. Women, children, any sign of humanity became liabilities in Muhsfeldt's world. Mothers cradled infants, whispering lullabies in languages their children would never speak outside. Children too young to understand fear still felt it in every scream, every lash of the whip. One day a child dropped a crust of bread. Muhsfeldt, in drunken mood, ordered him dragged from line, beaten in front of everyone, then thrown alive into the furnace. A woman, trembling, trying to comfort her child. Muhsfeldt saw her tears, saw humanity, and crushed it. Any softness, any compassion, any curiosity became acts of treason. Under his rule, even hope was punished. The darkest peak came with operations like Harvest Festival, a massacre so vast it defied ordinary understanding. Over a day or two, tens of thousands were slaughtered. Jews in Majdanek, Poniatowa, Trauniki forced to strip, marched to trenches, ordered to lie down, shot in waves. Men, women, children. Loud music blared over loudspeakers. Propaganda had its uses even here, to drown out the gunfire, cries, chaos. Graves had been dug in advance. Trenches zigzagged in fields outside the camps. At dawn, Muhsfeldt, or people like him, oversaw these scenes as though overseeing the clearing of livestock. He saw the bodies piling up. He saw the living stepping into death. He ordered, watched, enforced. Operation Harvest Festival was the largest single massacre by German forces in the Holocaust. Its scale a statement. There would be no refuge, no mercy. Muhsfeldt's cruelty was never merely bureaucratic paperwork. It was intimate, personal. He frequently came into the gas chamber areas intoxicated, the smell of alcohol masking the stench of death. He carried a baton, sometimes wore a twisted smile when prisoners stumbled under forced march or despair. He would pick someone from the crowd, someone too weak, someone too loud, someone daring to cry out, and make them suffer in front of others. Beatings for minor errors, selections for termination, personal participation in executions. He did not hide behind orders. He relished the power. Once the killing machines ran, they became part of daily life. Gas chambers were no longer experimental, but built, reinforced, turned into showrooms of terror. The crematoriums hummed, ovens working non-stop. Bodies came in from transports, from roll calls, from selections. On days when deaths from natural causes were low, Muhsfeldt's camp staff made selections simply to meet quotas. Bodies too many for ovens were burned in pits or in forested areas nearby. Ashes scattered, mass graves emptied and refilled. It was not enough to kill. One had to maintain efficiency, routine consistency. This was Muhsfeldt's hallmark. In that routine, even survival became a punishment. Prisoners lived under constant expectation of death. They smelled the burning corpses every sunrise. They heard the muffled screams, saw the smoke stains on the wind. They lived in terror that any moment a selection could call their name. They learned to whisper, to walk on broken feet, to carry the dead, to keep their voices low. But sometimes they dared to show a flicker of resistance, a stolen piece of bread, a soothing word to a child, a look of defiance. For those, Muhsfeldt had particular cruelty, to punish in view of others, to show that even mercy itself was a lie. Children suffered perhaps more than any others. Muhsfeldt's personal orders included selecting children, tiny, innocent, simply because they could not work. He used their fear as entertainment. He forced them to watch mothers die, siblings torn away. Sometimes he flung them into gas, sometimes beat them to silence before death. Their shrieks, their confusion, everything he used as power over the living. Women too, forced into dehumanizing labor, often sexually abused, always vulnerable. A woman crying over a child, a mother begging for mercy. Muhsfeldt saw not humanity but tools, shame, terror, control. By this stage, mass murder was no aberration. It was architecture. The camp was designed around killing, infrastructure, gas chambers, ovens, selection ramps, crematoria, each built to exact specifications. Staff trained to ignore faces, to see only bodies, quotas, orders. Muhsfeldt spoke in numbers. How many gassed today? How many burned? How many were too weak? His heart hardened, his eyes dull. Yet when speaking before his superiors, he would boast of efficiency, of numbers, of how smoothly the death machinery worked. It was not just killing. It was a perverse management of murder. Even among Nazi hierarchy, some whispered that Majdank's operations were extreme, but Muhsfeldt cared little. He considered cruelty a virtue, death a tool, and as the factories around him churned smoke and flame, he walked with a calmness others found terrifying. He was in command. He had built the peak of evil, and yet in the shadow of that peak the seeds of unraveling had been planted. Witnesses, survivors, the exposed smoke, the fleeing guards. But at the height of Muhsfeldt's cruelty, nothing seemed to stop the machine. No shame, no conscience, only horror made normal. On July 24, 1944, the Red Army reached the gates of Majdanek in German-occupied Poland. The Soviet soldiers encountered a camp largely intact, barracks still standing, gas chambers still unused but in place, crematoria ovens not yet demolished. The Nazis, in their desperate retreat, had attempted to obliterate evidence. They tried to burn buildings, destroy records, set fire to archives, but had not managed to complete the destruction. Smoke lingered. Structural damage was visible, but the horrors within could still be seen with chilling clarity. Very few prisoners remained alive. Many who could walk had been evacuated. Many others died in the final days, but several hundreds, starved, ill, severely weakened, were found in the barracks and infirmaries. These survivors, some physically unable even to speak, bore witness with their bodies, skeletons under taut skin, eyes glazed, many in the last degree of suffering. Alongside them were heaps of personal belongings, shoes, clothing, suitcases, toys, a mass of intimate artifacts abandoned as if life had been stripped away all at once. The Red Army, upon entry, immediately reached out, journalists, photographers. International observers were invited to document every corridor, every room, every chamber where death had quietly reigned. What the world then saw would force a reckoning with what the final solution meant, not as abstraction, not as propaganda, but as reality. The gas chambers, the charred ovens, the piles of ash, the skeletal remains lined up in trenches or scattered across yards, all spoke of systematic, planned extermination. Reports and photos circulated quickly. Witnesses spoke of Zyklon B fumes, selections, mothers torn from children, children who never understood mercy. Majdanek was no longer a name among many. It became a symbol, a warning carved in bone and flame. The scale of the atrocity stunned the world. Initial estimates placed the number of deaths at Majdanek between 80,000 and 120,000, including those murdered in gas chambers, those shot, those starved, those worked to death. Among them, tens of thousands were Jewish. Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, and other nationals filled the ranks of the victims. The camp had detained more than 150,000 prisoners over its operation. The death tolls, the numbers of transports arriving, the declarations by survivors and staff, all contributed to a public record that could no longer be ignored. Majdanek had become one of the most horrific testaments of genocide in Eastern Europe. In those days after liberation, Muhsfeldt's role was exposed. Survivors recounted his cruelty, his selections, his commanding presence in the gas chambers and crematoria. Investigators found documents, lists, registration logs, even photographs showing operations. Testimonies pointed to his presence at selections, witnesses recalling a man issuing orders, walking among the ovens, pointing, choosing, supervising. The evidence was overwhelming and corroborated, making him not just a name among SS officers, but one of those central to carrying out the machinery of death at Majdanek. Journalists published articles. War correspondents sent images of ovens, gas chambers, piles of shoes. Museums and memorials would later preserve these places. The world reacted. Governments, survivors, civilians shocked into awareness. There was outrage, disbelief, and sorrow, but also a demand for justice, for memory. Majdanek's liberation revealed the full mechanics of Nazi extermination. Not only that millions died, but how they were deceived, transported, dehumanized, chosen, and discarded. The term final solution ceased to be a distant policy. It was seen, smelled, heard by those who lived through its instruments. This revelation changed the course of history's understanding of evil. Majdanek became one of the first major camps liberated by the Red Army, giving overwhelming proof that the genocide was far greater than many believed. It showed that even as Nazis attempted to hide their crimes, the scope was almost visible. The infrastructure of murder, the scale of suffering, the faces of survivors too weak to stand. Muhsfeldt's deeds, once hidden in bureaucratic orders, now stood exposed in testimony and ruin. The world would no longer accept denial. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Erich Muhsfeldt did not vanish in the chaos. Allied troops, moving through the ruins, arrested countless SS officers. Many were captured in camps, in transport convoys, or hiding among civilians. Muhsfeldt was detained in one such sweep, his uniform ripped, face haggard but his eyes still cold. He was first held by American forces, who recognized the necessity of bringing such monstrous acts into court. In their zones of control, Muhsfeldt was tried in a U.S. military court, charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the systematic slaughter of innocent men, women, and children. After initial hearings, due process, and mounting evidence from liberated prisoners, the U.S. agreed to extradite Muhsfeldt to Poland, where many of the victims had perished, and where the fullest record of his guilt had been preserved. The trial held in Auschwitz began quietly, but would become one of the defining moments in post-war justice. Family members, survivors, camp staff, and German witnesses were called to stand. Survivors whose bodies bore scars, who had witnessed selections, who had smelled the gas, who had pressed hands into burning bodies, thus spoke, their voices cracked but unwavering. Photographs, piles of ash, official logs, train manifests were paraded into the courtroom as evidence. Prosecutors presented the systematic nature of Muhsfeldt's cruelty, how he selected the weak, supervised gas chamber operations, ordered beatings, tortures, and burnings, how death rose in volume under his watch. Defense attorneys attempted denials, shifting blame to orders, to the chaos of war, claiming following orders or not knowing the full extent, but the weight of evidence, eyewitness testimony, documentation, even confessions, was overwhelming. On the day of verdict, the court found Muhsfeldt guilty of multiple counts, crimes against humanity, genocide, mass murder, and abuse of the laws of war. His personal participation, beyond being a bureaucrat, in ordering, supervising, and committing atrocities weighed heavily. The sentence, death by hanging. The judge's voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the gravity of history. The sentence was not only punishment, but a symbol that no matter one's rank or claims, the law would hold even the most monstrous accountable. Execution day came, January 24, 1948. At Montelupic prison in Kov, the sentence was carried out. Muhsfeldt, aged 34, was led to the gallows. As the trapdoor opened, there was silence, a final breath, a moment where the air held more than grief. After death, his body was not returned to family. Instead, it was given to medical students at the University of Krakow for anatomical study, a practice with grim symbolism, treating the corpse as specimen after he had treated humans as disposable. Muhsfeldt's family story closed in parallel with his demise. His wife had been killed in an Allied air raid in 1944. His son, sent to the Russian front, was declared missing and presumed dead. No public mourning was recorded. Survivors and nations mourned instead. Muhsfeldt never expressed regret. According to records, he died without apology. Some accounts say that before execution, he maintained a chilling calm, refusing to acknowledge the scale of his guilt. In prison letters, he attributed much of his behavior to orders, to the war, to duty, but not remorse. The trial of Muhsfeldt left a permanent mark. It established beyond reasonable doubt not only what Muhsfeldt did, but how someone can sink from ordinary life into monstrous deeds and then be brought at last into a courtroom to answer for every act. The survivors who testified reclaimed their voices. Photographs, documents, visitor records, orders, all became part of the permanent record of what humanity can do, and what law must do when humanity fails. Years have passed since the smoke cleared, and the voices of survivors echoed through courtrooms. Yet the memory of those days still lingers, etched in charred walls, in piles of ash, in the silent names of the dead. Though time moves forward, the evil that unfolded under Muhsfeldt's command refuses to lie dormant. What was done must never be allowed to vanish into abstraction. These were not distant statistics or faceless events, far removed from reality. Each number in the death toll was once a person, with a name, with dreams, with families. Mothers who sang in lullabies, children who laughed, fathers who tried to protect. When we say 80,000 to 120,000 died, we must remember, those people breathed, suffered, hoped. The horror was real, blood and bone and fire and tears. History is often spoken of in terms so large they can numb the mind. But here, in the shadow of Majdanek, each lost life is indivisible from its human weight. To remember is not simply to commemorate, but to keep alive the possibility of empathy. When we speak of Muhsfeldt's crimes, we don't do so to wallow in darkness, but to look in the mirror of humanity and ask, if one man could descend into such cruelty, what prevents another from doing so? Evil, when hidden, grows. When remembered and spoken, it warns us. It demands vigilance, not guilt. It insists that we never treat human life lightly. There is a justice in memory. Though Muhsfeldt was hanged, the process of judgment continues each time someone recalls the names of the dead, each time a teacher opens a history book, each time a survivor testifies or a student listens. The world is indeed better without Muhsfeldt's presence, but more than that, it is made stronger by the refusal to let his deeds be forgotten. Evil may take lives, but memory takes no prisoners. And so here we end, not with a moralizing sermon, not with a plea for perfection, but with a quiet resonance. The story of Erich Muhsfeldt, horrific and extreme, is part of a broader map of human potential. Greatness and depravity, compassion and cruelty. May this story remain open in our minds, not resolved because history rarely is, not distant because its echoes still reach us, and not meaningless because meaning is something we carry forward.